Welcome to The Other Worlds, where we talk to authors of fantasy, supernatural, and paranormal stories. Let's open the portal and meet our guest.
Hello, my name is Sandra Dan, and I am joined today by KP Kulski. KP Kulski is the author of Fairest Flesh, House of Pung Su, and is a self-described career vampire of patriarchal tears. She has just edited Silk and Sinew, which just came out last week, a collection of folk horror from the Asian diaspora. And Kristy is joining me today to talk a little bit about Silk and Sinew and her writing. Welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, I was wondering a little bit about this anthology and its genesis. And I know that a few years ago, Lee Murray and Genevieve, I'm not sure if I'm saying her name right, Flynn.
Genevieve, yeah.
Yeah, they started a conversation about women of Asian heritage in horror, and that led to Black Crane's Tales of Unquiet Women, coming out, a collection of stories, and that won a Stoker Award. And then they actually joined with some other women of Asian heritage and released a poetry collection, Tortured Willows, Bent, Bowed, Unbroken. And I was wondering, were those influences on you with Silk and Sinew, or how do you feel that that they've changed the discussion to pave the way for collections like Silk and Sinew to be published?
I feel that Silk and Sinew is absolutely like a child of that movement. It's Lee Murray and Genevieve Flynn, Rena Mason as well from her work, Angela Yuriko Smith, Christina Sung, they've paved the way for works like Silk and Sinew. And it was my time really getting to know Lee, who really opened up that for me to explore my Korean heritage. I think it's a common belief for a lot of authors of Asian descent in the Western world to kind of feel like we don't need to tell our stories. We need to tell the stories that are expected. And Lee really gave me permission to do that and to delve into that. So I see them as the founders, really, quite frankly. And with Silk and Sinew, they have all been like 1000% behind like help, any kind of support I needed, any questions I had, they were there. In fact, we had a phone call one time to figure out the name because I couldn't at first, like if I don't have the name right away, I usually like just stress about it forever. So yeah, we got on and workshopped that together. So yeah, they've been, behind this as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, with Silk and Sinew, you have authors from the Asian diaspora, and they're from all over Asia. You have in the book, you've got stories set in Indonesia, you've got stories set in India. You're traveling to all of these different lands. How do you approach that as an editor? Because obviously you have Korean heritage, but you're working with authors who have a different heritage who are telling stories relevant to their culture. How did you approach that?
Well, I think something I keep kind of telling a lot of people who are doing anthologies and looking to have diversity in their anthologies is that you have to work toward that. You have to, build trust. I felt like I wanted to ensure because, in for East Asians, it is not uncommon. There's colorism as a thing in particular, but in Asia in general, but it's not uncommon to leave out like South Asians. And I was pretty determined to prevent that from happening. And a lot of questions came up too to think about, like, well, what do you mean when you say Asian? And one big question I asked myself, was does does a group of people have a table. And there's no table you can always sit with us, was my thought, you know? And that it was important that we pull together the concept of Asian together and have it be more inclusive versus exclusionary. So that was something I very much thought about. It was a huge part of why I also made sure there was a call out that allowed South Asian authors first to submit.
Okay, so it, yeah, I was very much interested in some of the themes about the in the book, and some of them, I guess, seem more familiar to me perhaps than others. That they, in the sense that they resonated. There's there are a couple of quotes that I marked. For example, from "The Heaven That Tastes Like Hell," you wonder if city doctors look similar, and you wonder why you would ever aspire to become such a thing, even if they save lives, even if they appear immortal, if you can't even save yourself from the drowning weight and pressure of being in this family, of your mother's expectations, solely because you are her one and only son. And also Mohini's wrath as well touches on expectations. It felt like this was a recurring theme that came up throughout, and I wondered how this is distinct for people of the Asian diaspora. Do you find that people who have Asian heritage um, and don't necessarily live, where their ancestors are from, face different types of family expectations?
I think that's definitely a common theme for a lot of folks. I always felt like it wasn't framed right. Excuse me. That there's certainly an element that's expectations, but I always felt like it was high hopes. You know, I know like Angela Eureka Smith just was talking the other day to me about feeling kind of she's moved to Brazil and she's like, I wonder how like my grandmother would feel about that. That my grandmother fought so hard and to come to the US and make a life, and I've left that life. And I feel like a huge part of it is this weight of like, am I fulfilling the sacrifices that were given, that were done for me, and subsequent generations. So I think a lot of us feel that to some extent. It varies a lot in terms of the experiences, and I really think that some of that really has to do about being part of the Asian diaspora as much as it has to do with being part of an immigrant experience, and being closer to the generation who immigrated. So it's definitely hard and it's heavy and it hits, I think, all of us in a different way. For me, I have a lot more distance. My mother passed away when I was young. I didn't have that kind of experience and pressure put on me in that way. But I think about it, I think, and I ask myself questions. Am I doing stuff that would make her proud? And I think that's something I think we all wonder sometimes about our parents.
Yep, that's fair enough. That I think that it is something that you carry with you, and it is different for you because your mother did pass when you were young, but in a different way that also creates or has the potential to create a further disconnect. So, how do you approach as a Korean American author who was born in Hawaii? You've obviously raised here in the United States. How do you form that connection to your heritage? How have you approached that personally?
That is an ongoing project. um, so, I think that being biracial, you just know you never really fit in anywhere, right? And you don't often get claimed. I think sometimes, like for me, I went through periods in my life where I just kind of didn't address it, being mixed at all. I can pass frequently as white. So um, it was uncomfortable for people. But then it would always pop up and it would be an uncomfortable thing as well. So I've had to learn that I am the one who gets to decide um, what and who my identity is. Um, and to be quite honest with you, I don't know that I'm ever going to be done with that journey, because it's constantly trying to find out who you are in a place that always wants to tell you who you are. Um, and it's funny, I actually was talking to my therapist, who's amazing, and she's also biracial. Um, and she said to me, one of the things about this experience is that we have to acknowledge that this is a world that's not built for us. And, like for those in the autistic spectrum, for example, there has been discussion about that, right? But then, we haven't had that same discussion for people who are mixed race. So I think that's a really interesting perspective. And I would say that would be the best answer. I feel like I rambled there, but the best way I could answer that.
Well, it is a journey, it's a process, and and I think though that there's something just admirable in terms of trying to explore who you are. Um, we do this on all levels in different ways. We explore our gender, we explore our sexuality. Those of us who are neurodiverse explore those elements of ourselves. So I think that it's important. It's funny that there's so much emphasis on ancestry. People love to find out about their ancestry and where their ancestors came from and whatnot. But it seems like there's a disconnect in terms of, oh, that was them then, I am this now. And we don't really have the encouragement to embrace those pieces that have been passed down to us. Whereas when you're mixed race and you're in a position where you actually are thinking about this and you're facing it in your day to day and it comes up, you actually are prompted to look into it. Whereas somebody like me, no, nobody asks where I'm from, which is a common question that people who aren't white get thrown at them all the time, which is very othering and frustrating in certain ways, because there's that sense of like, do you belong here? And yet you were born and raised here. So, I mean, that's me rambling, but like that's me thinking about like, how do you be fully American and fully Korean? Because you are both things. You're not one.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think some of our discussions online too, you talk about that with being American and Canadian as well too. I mean, and those identities they can exist simultaneously, right? And that, the best one, I think I've ever explanation for it I've seen is June Her posted a while back, I believe on Instagram. She had kind of gone through like being really stressed out about whether or not she could be authentic enough in writing. And she went to her mom. And her mom said something to the effect of like, look, when Koreans who, speak Korean and were brought up in the United States, they speak with an accent, they speak Korean with an accent. And she said, what you write, these stories, really, it's not that they're not authentic as much as you speak with an accent. And that an accent is a beautiful story in itself because it talks a lot about where you've been. I've held on to that because I think that's exactly, it just spoke to me so much, and that's very much what I feel like I'm trying to discuss, in all my work in bringing Silk and Sinew to the forefront, because I think all of us have that. We all have, from all parts, all heritage of Asia, we have our own unique accents in that. Some situations, some folks they have the immigrant experience themselves. Sometimes it's spending time in a Western nation for college, and then returning to whatever Asian country they're from originally. Then it can be, second generation of those of us who are born in the United States with an immigrant parent. All those experiences are valid and they're not discussed enough, I feel like. So I think there's so many variations of those experiences.
Well, it's wonderful that you're delving into this in Silk and Sinew, and I wondered how you approached organizing the stories because you have these unique sections, and I was wondering how that came about.
That one I knew like right away. When I really started to associate the fact, because I say in the book too, in the afterword, that this kind of was born from sitting in a panel, listening to a panel on folk horror, and realizing the discussion is so much about what's the a past that's that was been buried in the soil that gets dug back up, and a lot of it was directly referring to like what's traditionally thought of as folk horror, usually like English, right? English countryside. um and I kept thinking to myself, I'm like, well, what does that mean for people in the Asian diaspora? um there's what are we digging up, and what's the soil for us? And I realized more and more that it's our bodies. It's our very bodies because we hold all of that. Um, I think in Tortured Willows in the forward, I was honored enough to I was very lucky to be able to write the forward for it. Um, I talk about how, we are both the ghosts and the haunted. Um, and I feel like that's just something about the experiences of our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors. We carry it all with us. We carry that immigration story with us. And we're reminded of it when we're told all the time that, like, and the question I've always heard is, what are you? And every mixed person, like, will eye roll because they very much know that very frustrating feeling of getting that question. Um, but you realize that history, is not far. And a lot of us come from, my mother was very young, but she lived through the war. Um, there was my family's experience with Japanese occupation in Korea. There's some really dark stuff, and tragedies coming to the United States. And we're made of that stuff, right? So, and we're carrying it around.
Well, it's interesting when you're talking about you're carrying it around and it's in our bodies, and then you mentioned earlier about living up to the hopes that you know that your parents and grandparents, whoever emigrated, had for you, because there's this reference in Mother's Daughter, to people giving up pieces of themselves for the next generation. And in that story, literally sacrificing parts of their body for that child. And so that and then there was this interesting relationship between the mother and the youngest daughter through most of the story. Um,
Mhm.
because the older daughter does give up some pieces of herself as well along the way, but the younger daughter is not allowed to. And 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 that she carries guilt because she feels that she should do this because others have done this for her, and the mother does not want her to have to do this. And I thought that was such an interesting story and perspective because it's showing how this generation has sacrificed, has bled, has suffered, has given up for you, and they don't want you to have to do the same thing. And it reflects that, perfectly through the story in terms of the hopes for better in the future, but also that literal giving up of your physical being for others.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that story just that story gets me. They all get me. Um, the idea, the funny thing is, I think that it is not just emotional. Like, a lot of our parents who are immigrants, like, who came from nothing, came from bad situations, fleeing war, fleeing bad economic situations, just poverty, they sacrifice their very bodies oftentimes, I mean, there's unfortunately for my family's history, my mother experienced a lot of domestic abuse, and with my father and her first husband, um, and so she sacrificed her body in that. It's the sacrifice of the body through the trauma, through constant work, lack of sleep. Um, you know, uh, and I do think that there's such a weight to ask yourself, well, did I do enough to make that worth it? Was I worth it? And it makes it so you can't be a kid, Um, I've heard especially a lot of older daughters, talk about that experience for themselves. They have the idea, just like in Mother's Daughter, the older daughter does have some physical sacrifice still to do. Um, but yeah, it really hit me when Audrey had that talked in there where, her mother is like, yeah, you're not supposed to do this. You're not allowed to. Why would you do that when I've done this, Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was really powerful. And but also like it also reminds you, even without saying it specifically, that there is a lot of bravery in making such a huge change for the betterment of your family, and so that there can be a future. And I think that it's something that can perhaps be easy to lose sight of. Um, but the people who who traveled to different countries and emigrated, and put down roots in new places and made all of those sacrifices at the same time were brave and courageous enough to take those steps into the unknown in the hopes that they could pass on a better life and a better future to their children. So there is that heartening sense, and perhaps there is the story is the title is out of my head at the moment, but there's that one story that's set in Indonesia that perhaps reminds you that returning isn't always exactly what you think it would be, and perhaps not always a good thing either. There's that interesting, uh, you know, dichotomy there of like, oh, it can sound so wonderful to go back and visit where your family came from. Perhaps you should be a little bit better prepared though, before you do so.
Right. Well, that's Nadia's things to know before you go.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's
yeah. Yeah, I'm thankful. I remember I'm always like, oh no, what is okay. So yeah, and I think that story is interesting too because it gives you an idea of what, like, you're othered no matter where you go, and that's not just the biracial experience too. For a lot of the Asian diaspora, you're considered the perpetual foreigner, at home, and then you think, well, maybe it'll be great if I go back to or excuse me, not back necessarily, but go to the place of my ancestry, and then finally I'll belong. And you end up finding out like you're other there too. So again, where do you fit? Because the truth is, you're your own unique culture, a fusion of cultures.
Yeah, well, that was actually something that this is a lifetime ago now, but in high school, I took a social studies course, and one of the things that they covered was the 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 immigrant experience, but from the perspective of, and bear in mind, you know, this dates me, but this was the 80s, so we're not talking an internet era. Um, one of the things they talked about was how when people would immigrate, they would carry over their culture and their beliefs and their traditions, and then they would sort of be like frozen in time. And so they didn't evolve the same way that things were evolving in the society that they left behind. And so it's almost like you create this ghost of a country and in some ways a culture that isn't fully there the same way anymore, and it's different, and you see some of that in that story because of the going back. And there was actually a line I had marked. Let's see if I can find it here real quick. um of course, this volcanic land had not stopped churning, shifting, grinding in the years that she'd been gone. She was a fool to imagine otherwise. Everything changes and it continues to move, and sometimes those things move in different directions. So it's interesting to see that explored in terms of the challenge. And there's almost there's a combination of a grief there because it's not going to stay the same way that it was when you live there if you're the person leaving. And if you're going back with your parents or your grandparents, it's not going to be the exact way that they remember it either. And so it's almost it's this you could look at it as a splintering, but you can also look at it um, as branches on the tree spreading out and adding more color and variety to to the source. And I guess it really depends on how you choose to look at it. But I think that's the challenge of like, of understanding that you can move on. You can preserve things the way that they were done decades ago. You can evolve, and both are true, and both can coexist, and both are valid.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that because I think that a lot of people don't actually understand that, my mother came during the 1970s and all my aunties and stuff, and you know, Korean culture was they were the zeitgeist for it from the 1970s, so like there's a lot of disconnect with like the popularity of K-pop, for example. Like, I think that's really cool. I don't have a lot of connection to it. Like the Koreans, I know the Koreans that were familiar to me are like very, you know, talk much more about, um, you know, for my mother, picking bracken and going, and making gochujang by hand and not buying it at the store, things that were just, rural, less, access to those kinds of very modern ideas, Um, so totally different flavor, right? A totally different way of looking at the world and how to approach things. Yeah.
Now, since you've edited this anthology, I was wondering how the experience of editing has influenced you as a writer.
Wow, that's a good question. Um, it has given me some confidence actually, with my writing. I feel like especially for Silk and Sinew, because a lot of the things that I felt like were important to write about that I felt like um, needed to be talked about were the kind of stories that I got. Um, I mean, this is a for everybody who contributed to it, this is very vulnerable. And these are stories that are not the kind of stories we generally get to hear and read. But I think they're so valuable and so necessary. So it gave me further confirmation that this needs to be done and that I need to forge forth with my own writing as well to tell that story from my perspective, because we all have our unique perspective on it.
That's fantastic. Now, I have to ask, since you are a self-described career vampire of patriarchal tears, where did that particular description come from? What was the genesis for that?
Um, So I always like to joke that I emerged fully as a fully formed feminist when I was born. Um, and the reason is I say that is like my father, was pretty conservative, both politically and personally. And my mother was very religious. She had still a lot of the ideas, and so do my aunties, about like, kind of listening to the men with power in your family and things like that. And I have bucked that at every turn in my life. I remember being young and being really mad in Rambo when the girl dies, so he could get upset and get revenge, and complaining about that. Um, so, I kind of have gotten to a place where, during the 90s, I was a teen in my 90s, in the 90s. So I remember coming against, a lot of folks who would look down on feminism and, um, criticize me for it, and criticize the movement in general. But, it always was felt very true to me and felt like it needed to be addressed. And, um, eventually I learned that the best response is to, why don't you just cry about it if you don't like it? I'm going to keep talking about it, and, I'm going to keep challenging that. So, I've got a cup ready.
That's fantastic. Are you drinking those tears or are you just chucking them out?
No, I'm drinking them. They gotta get fuel to keep doing this. I actually have a mug with that on it. It's not, unfortunately, it's not the one I have with me today, but yeah, it's one of my favorite mugs.
Well, that's fantastic. It's a great descriptor, and it definitely makes your bio stand out, when you read it because it's like your sense of humor and your beliefs, your values come through in that, in that one descriptor right there. So, which is fantastic.
Oh,
So, I
good.
have to ask, what do you hope that readers take away from Silk and Sinew? I mean, you might want to answer that in two parts. Like, what do you hope that a reader like me takes away from it, as well as what do you hope that people who are mixed race, who have Asian heritage take away from it?
I hope that people, who are of the Asian diaspora see their stories. They get to say, wow, I get that. I haven't seen that somewhere, and now I feel seen, I feel heard, um, and that my story matters. Um, I hope that people who are mixed race in general, um, find how many common threads there are. Um, I hope that those who are not part of the Asian diaspora, get a view into something that they never really understood before, and they see the humanity, of the experience, that it's complicated, um, and that, frequently one of the things that always struck me, um, when we, heard stories, especially classical literature about Asia, was always through the perspective, of a Eurocentric perspective, right? But it would be these like, wow, this is so interesting, right? Um, um, the culture and people and things like that. And I'd be like, well, if it's so interesting, why don't we get that perspective? And I think this is an opportunity to finally say, like, look, that story, that perspective is, extremely rewarding if you spend some time with it.
So, before we wrap things up, is there anything that you can share with us about what's on the horizon for you next?
Well, so my agent is shopping a book for me right now, so I hope that gets to see, gets to find a really good home. On that one, I probably shouldn't talk too much exactly of the particulars of it, but, I also have a work in progress right now that is very much inspired by Silk and Sinew, and specifically, Asian diaspora folk horror. It's kind of a direct challenge to picking out the, idea of the perpetual foreigner, and the very idea that Asians have been in North America for a long time, and we haven't talked about that history. So, yeah, definitely picking that apart.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about Silk and Sinew, and I wish this anthology all the best. I'm sure it was a wonderful experience working with all the authors, and I hope that they found it as inspiring as as you did editing it.
Mhm. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been lovely to be here and talk to you.